All right, so as many of you may know, I am Amanda Perry. I am the Executive Director for the NACBS, and I want to thank you all for joining us today to hear more about managing mobility, the British Imperial State and Global Migration, 1840 to 1860. I'm going to be briefly introducing our guests, and then I will turn it over to them for a conversation about the work. So Phil Harling is Professor of History and Director of the Center for Humanities at the University of Miami. In addition to managing mobility, which we'll be hearing about today, he's the author of The Waning of Old Corruption, The Politics of Economical Reform in Britain, 1779 to 1846, and The Modern British State, an Historical Introduction, and various articles and book chapters. He started work on what he hopes will turn into a monograph on the starkly contrasting relationships between taxation and the military in metropolitan and colonial contexts in the 1840s and 1850s. And so he's going to be joined in conversation today by Jill Bender, who is Associate Professor of History at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. She is the author of the 1857 Indian Uprising and the British Empire, and numerous book chapters and journal articles. Her research has received support from several funding bodies, including the National Humanities Center, the National Endowment for the Humanities, and the American Philosophical Society. Bender is currently working on a book project in which she examines the famine-era migration of women from Ireland's workhouses to colonies in Australia, Canada, and Southern Africa. So I hope everyone will join me in welcoming Phil and Jill today, and I will turn it over to Jill to get started.
Great. Thank you so much, Amanda, and thank you, Phil, for inviting me to do this. It was a real pleasure to read your book. I thought I'd start, for those of you who have not yet read the book, with just a little bit of an overview. Let me also say, if you've not yet read the book, I highly encourage you to do so. It's very accessible, very thoughtfully argued, and very thoroughly researched. In Managing Mobility, Phil argues that the massive migration of the mid-19th century was not entirely spontaneous, but instead there was an ideological framework to guide these massive migration projects, and this ideological framework was informed by a small group of elite officials who believed, as he put it, in big utopian dreams and the promises of the empire's subject peoples. Now, if I have this right, this is your third book, is that right, Phil?
You've got that right, Jill. Yeah.
That's what I thought. And you know, as I'm struggling to finish my second book, I'm very aware of how different it is to write a second, or I imagine a third book, since most of our first books come from our dissertations. And so in kind of reflecting on that and knowing this was your third book, and in your acknowledgments, you mentioned that the book was a long time in the making. So I'm wondering if you could just say a few words about how you came to the project, how it changed throughout the process, both of researching and writing it. And, you know, was the experience of writing this book very different from your other two books? You know, did it have its own unique joys and probably challenges as well?
Yeah, thanks for that. And the answer to that latter question is definitely both challenges and joys. You know, taking a long view of things, I've always been interested in issues of governance and the state, and what states meant, because it's the first half of the 19th century, we're thinking about what they were up to, and legitimating elite authority has been a kind of a through line for me. I think a lot of historians of Britain of my generation, I'm 61 now. When I was in grad school, there really was still a bit of a dramatic bifurcation between doing metropolitan British history and doing the history of the empire. And I was trained very much and very well as chiefly a metropolitan British historian. And like a lot of people, I was influenced over the years to try to take more of an imperial turn. For me, that was slow going. I had to see some other people who successfully executed that. And I've got a lot of people I admire out there who made that turn. Richard Price is somebody I want to shout out to, because he's been very influential in the way I think about trying to negotiate that transition. And he's also a guy who really helped me, convince me that I had a book out of these ideas that I was playing with here. And the first experiment I tried to make in beginning to make that imperial turn was to look at penal policy. And I realized that I knew nothing about convict transportation to Australia. And it always interested me. So I wrote an article about that, which was really kind of looking at it in terms of penological practice and the relationship between metropolitan change and the growing indictment, the growing dissatisfaction in the Australian colonies with convict transportation itself, and how that imposed very dramatic penal changes back in the metropole. So that became kind of a first test case. And then along with that, I've always been kind of interested in what to me remain kind of the paradoxes of empire and liberalism. Because I've written in the metropolitan context about the way the British elite justifies itself by making government smaller, cheaper, by embracing free trade, by being seen to be less openly parasitical on the broader public. And it was only with more and more reading that I realized that as this was happening in Britain, arguably the reverse was happening in the empire. And so that got me interested in free trade, and got me onto the subject of the Anglo-Chinese Wars of the mid-19th century, and a lot of the mess that makes of the notion of free trade, how constructing a global economic order that redounds chiefly to the advantage of Britain creates a lot of havoc, a lot of destruction, a lot of death in other corners of the globe. And so gradually I realized that migration was a way to address a lot of these sorts of issues. I knew nothing about the history of migration in the 19th century, other than that it accelerated greatly in this mid-Victorian era, which I thought was still relatively understudied when it came to thinking about connections between metropole and empire. So it became a way to connect up these different ideas that I'd had. And so this book is my effort to try to make that connection and try to explore the difficult, the thorny relationship between liberalism and empire in the 1840s and 1850s, about which I thought we didn't really know quite as much about until pretty recently. I see there are a lot of people on the call here, and it's great to see them. I've been influenced by many folks who've been looking at the same period at the same time. And so I've greatly benefited from a lot of recent work, which is dealing with some of these thorny issues. I see John Connolly here, and I just want to give a shout out to John because I think his book is absolutely terrific and helped me to think a little bit more about the connection between the metropole and the British Caribbean, which looms very large in my narrative as well. So that's kind of a blathering, lengthy answer to your question, Jill, but I kind of blundered into this over quite a long period of time. And some people whose opinions I really trust led me to believe that I could actually get a monograph out of it. And it took me forever to do it, but I'm really glad it's finally arrived.
Well, thank you. And I agree. We have a wonderful group here online. And so I would quickly like to open it up to questions more broadly. But before I do so, your answer wasn't blathering. It actually did lead very well into another question I had. And that's, you mentioned that you're kind of the first way you dipped your toes into this was by looking at that penal colony. And one thing that struck me as I was reading this book is just the wide variety of case studies you engage with in order to make your argument. And I was wondering if you could, it sounds like you started with penal transportation, but could you say a little bit more about how you came to these case studies? How'd you select them? How'd you tie them together? Were there any that you thought all along would be in the book and then got thrown out, or some that came late to the game that had to be in there?
Yeah, it was very hit and miss for a while until I really started thinking a lot about the Colonial Land and Emigration Commission, or CLEC, the CLEC, which is a fancy title for three dudes who worked out of a small office on Park Street in Westminster. And what I came to realize as I started poking around the Colonial Office archives is that these guys had a pretty significant hand in the movement of massive numbers of mostly poor white, black, and brown people the world over. They were involved in the transportation of convicts. They were particularly involved in trying to subsidize the migration of so-called free immigrants to Australia, and the transition from convict to free white Australia looms very large in the manuscript, because that was an enormously ambitious social engineering project for the day that ultimately moved hundreds of thousands of people from the British Isles to Australia in a deliberate effort to create a particular kind of white settler colony. Kleck was central in the movement of those people. It was absolutely critical to the opening stages of the indentured migration from mostly Calcutta and Madras to the British Sugar Islands, chiefly the ones that were growing and becoming more prosperous in this period when Jamaica is beginning to fall on hard times for a variety of reasons, and that is then British Guyana and Trinidad. They helped to, Kleck helped to find the ships to do the moving. They were very actively involved in a correspondence with the government of India, with the recruitment of Indian workers to become indentured sugar workers in the Caribbean. Finally, Kleck had a lot to say about the famine emigration from Ireland, which I thought about pretty early on, because here's an example where the British government really didn't get involved. Population historians talk a lot about spontaneous migration in the mid-19th century, and the famine migration tends to be a case study in that, where catastrophe basically pushed millions of people out of Ireland, and they had to figure out a way to flee. And the British taxpayer wasn't on the hook for moving Irish people to Canada, and the U.S. in any way. So that's kind of different. The state doesn't really get involved in that migration, but what ties them all together, I think, is the predisposition among the British governing class and the Kleck to think about an emerging globalizing economy in a way that disproportionately advantages Britain. So the so-called spontaneous movement of poor, starving Irish peasants to North America as a way of depopulating Ireland in a way that facilitates the growth of pasturage at the expense of tillage, which is exactly what the governing elite in London would like to see happen. It saves the sugar economy in the British Caribbean from sinking into being non-competitive with slave sugar, which is still being produced at a more rapid rate in Brazil and Cuba after emancipation. It solves the chronic problem of labor shortage in the British Caribbean in the wake of emancipation and in the wake of free trade in sugar, which is engineered by the British Parliament in 1846, which causes a second crisis within the same generation in Caribbean sugar production. And it really helps to turn convict Ireland into an Ireland of free white settlement, which becomes an economy that's increasingly sophisticated. It starts out as basically a wool plantation. It gradually diversifies over the course of the 19th century with the growth of what ends up being one of the world's most urban populations. And that a diversifying economy, which is very well plugged into the City of London. It's greatly facilitated by the discovery of gold, obviously, and chiefly in Victoria in the early 1850s. But sponsored migration of white Brits to Australia continues and only intensifies as the 19th gives place to the 20th century. So I'm looking at the roots of all this. And as part of what I like to think of as the great bifurcation of the 19th century world, between a growing area of white settlement, which is increasingly plugged into capital markets, particularly in London and later in New York, and not only the perpetuation, but the growth of plantation economies in the global South, which are perpetuated by projects of for the time, immensely ambitious social engineering that involve the movement of hundreds of thousands of people, literally half a world away, in the case of the lengthening of the colonial sugar belt in the middle decades of the 19th century. And these trends are already well established, but they intensify in the post-emancipation era in ways that I find interesting. And I thought that the sponsored movement of poor people by the British imperial state was one way of thinking about this as a global phenomenon.
In looking at the roots of what were essentially social engineering projects, would you argue that, or do you think that the members of the CLEC or any historical actors involved in organizing these were kind of, I guess, conscious of the possibilities of these different projects? Did they choose the migration projects themselves to kind of forward a larger idea about empire, or did they kind of stumble into the possibilities that these gave for the state? In other words, did they tailor them, or was the design kind of reactive?
I think it was mostly reactive, and I think even to a certain extent, maybe not even completely conscious.
Mm.
I think they were taking advantage of certain situations. The founder migration is probably the most obvious case in point, in that the British government took advantage of this catastrophe to accelerate a kind of political economic trend that they wanted to see accelerated, with the radical depopulation of the Irish countryside, to create more space for a kind of pasturage, which to their minds was going to be more valuable within this globalizing economy, to finally help to solve the answer to the problem of too many peasants hanging onto the land, right? As far as West Indian sugar, it really was in response to the outcry from sugar planters who were desperate for a plantation labor source in the wake of emancipation, because the last thing that African Caribbean people wanted to do after emancipation was to work on sugar plantations if they could possibly avoid doing that. And so you see the growth of squatting in colonies like Jamaica, Trinidad, Guyana, and it leaves a labor shortage, which causes a crisis for the plantocracy. The government in Westminster, like the planters themselves, cannot imagine a British Caribbean that isn't driven by the production of sugar. They don't particularly value the growth of peasant proprietorship among freed people. They see that the only way that the Caribbean colonies can continue adding value to the global economy is the way they'd long since done, and that is through the sugar monoculture. So the Indian migration has its roots in that, and we can talk more about the experimentation that the British government helps to guide and sponsor, but reactively, to try to bring poor people from other parts of the world to become indentured workers in the sugar colonies. In Australia, again, it's the white authorities in the colonies who really have a desperate need for more and more labor, particularly as the economy begins to mature, and that convict workers are not going to be sufficient to continue to build an increasingly sophisticated economy, which is more and more urban in nature. And so there's a great demand for skilled laborers from the UK, and also for young women who in the first instance can work as domestic workers and then ideally become wives and help propagate the white species, to put it pretty crudely, in the Australian setting. And so for that migration to happen, of course, it's immensely expensive. It's prohibitively expensive for poor white Britons for the most part. So it's heavily subsidized through the sale of crown lands in Australia, which the CLEC handles on behalf of the Australian colonies until most of those colonies are given responsible government in the 1850s. So that's a pretty deliberate social engineering project, but again, one which is largely driven from the colonies, and that the metropolitan authorities are actively involved with and participating in, trying to get the Australian authorities the kinds of migrants that they want, but often failing. And there's, of course, all sorts of moral judgments applied to poor immigrants on both sides. And so there's this constant kind of negotiation between the authorities in London and the authorities in Australia about what kind of migrants are most in need, and who the CLEC can actually recruit and put on ships.
Thank you. I'm taking notes as you're talking, and I certainly have more questions, both based on reading the book and then also on what you've offered here today, just this morning or this afternoon, I guess now. But before I launch into those, I would actually like to open it up and see if there are questions from those who have joined us online. And you're welcome to either drop them in the chat or just raise your hand. Of course, I can't see everyone the way I have this set up. I don't know if you can, Phil.
I see Jeff Auerbach's got his hand up.
Yeah, go for it, Jeff.
Hi, Phil. How you doing? Love hearing about the love hearing about this project. I'm just curious how you discovered CLEC and what those particular archives were like.
Yeah, well, they're part of the Colonial Office series. And there are a couple of numbers that are solely devoted to CLEC correspondence. And I stumbled into them through a footnote to a book that was written by an American scholar named Fred Inglis that I think was published in, I want to say 1929. And it's actually it's a good administrative history. And I learned a lot about the CLEC, depending on your preference, from Inglis's book. But the more deeply I got into the reading of the CLEC papers, the more I saw the interconnectedness of these very different migrations that are happening simultaneously. Because on any given day, they're corresponding with authorities the world over on any one of these different kinds of migration. So you really do kind of get this image of an empire which is being kind of totally thought about in an improvisatory way by these three guys in the cramped office in Westminster who were just being overwhelmed by a flood of paper coming in to them from all directions and carrying on a correspondence about all of them simultaneously. And then other colonial office officials are very involved in this. The third Earl Grey, the son of the father of the Reform Act, was a colonial secretary between 1846 and 1852. And it seems like he spent his every waking moment commenting on these various issues. And so there's this immensely dense web of correspondence, and also within the records of the different colonies themselves. Something that I found really quite revealing was what the CLEC and what the Colonial Office undersecretaries had to say on the backs of memoranda that were submitted to them by colonial governors in places like Trinidad, which really kind of gave a clue into the way they were reading a lot of this correspondence and the way they were trying to make sense of it. So that's how I sort of blundered into it, and it became, for me at least, a bit of a gold mine. And I really got sucked down that rabbit hole, and gave me a sense of how they were trying to think about this empire and how they were trying to improvise these migration patterns. Because something I really want to emphasize is that they were incredibly improvisational and involved the long distance traffic in human beings that led to a great deal of sickness and death. And the mortality rates on a lot of these immigrant vessels were alarming. In certain areas, at certain times, they rivaled the mortality rates of the worst years of the slave trade in the 18th century. And seeing the reportage on some of those catastrophes was also, to me, quite revealing. And I begin each of my chapters with a sea voyage, and most of them, sadly, go very badly. They're tragic tales, but they speak to these constellations of issues that I'm talking about, and they speak to the highly improvisational nature of the way that the British Imperial government is trying to direct the movement of people in this first age of mass migration. And the CLEC archive provides a really interesting window into that. So thanks for that question.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Phil.
I see Stuart Ward. I see Seth Coben. Stuart, how about you?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. Congratulations on the book. I should say at the outset that I'm only halfway through it, but I'm far enough into it to ask at least one question. I just want to ask if you could reflect a little bit more on how you see the book in dialogue with other major works in the field. And two books that spring to mind in particular are James Bellich's Replenishing the Earth and Eric Richards's Britannia's Children, both books that you're implicitly, and in the case of Richards, explicitly in dialogue with. To what extent do you see your work coming in as a corrective to these works? I mean, in the case of Bellich, it's obviously a very different kind of book. Empirically, methodologically, you're coming at the topic from a very different perspective. So what do you think, what does Bellich have to learn from reading your book? To what extent does it offer, a critique of that book? And the same goes for Richards. There you seem to use Richards as a kind of a placeholder for the view that emigration in the mid-19th century was spontaneous, that it wasn't driven by any kind of ideological framework. But you seem hesitant to sort of critique him directly, because you then go on to say, that the emigration state, which we normally associate with the period after the First World War, long predates that period. So did I detect a certain hesitation to really go in hard at Eric Richards? Was that some kind of respect for the dearly departed? Perhaps say a little bit more about the potential for some polemics that don't really entirely emerge in the book.
Right. Thanks for that, Stuart. Yeah, part of it is that I'm a good-natured person, and I hate to argue with people, but part of it also, in the case of Eric Richards, is that I've learned so much from his corpus of work. I could not have written the Australian portions of this book without being guided by his immense knowledge and research, and I have great admiration for everything I've read of his. And there's plenty of his that I haven't even read yet because he was alarmingly productive. But I didn't want to use him as a straw figure. But at the same time, I do know that my reflex action in thinking about why is it that all of a sudden 50 million Europeans are on the move in the second half of the 19th century, when before that, maybe, I don't know, tens of thousands of them were. What happened, right? That Richards's explanation for that was largely a spontaneous one, that a lot of it had to do with people would venture out for a bunch of different push and pull factors that had little to do with government, if anything to do with government intervention, and then would establish themselves and then in the case of white settlement, particularly in Australia, chain migration would gradually develop. And of course, all of that is true. But Richards is also the first guy I read who said, look, the whitening of Australia was a deliberate act. And it's crazy to think that you could go basically as far away from the British Isles as possible in the globe and set up this kind of a white republic. How did that happen? And spontaneity is part of that story, and probably the part that I think he covers most ably. But I felt that there was more to say about the ways in which both the metropolitan government, and I think particularly the colonial governments, were trying to direct that movement of people, and just how expensive it was for poor people to get to the other side of the world. It really couldn't have happened any other way unless they'd been transported. So that's Richards, and with Bellich, it's kind of the same thing. I think I don't know that Jim Bellich has anything to learn from me, but I had a lot to learn from him in the sense that he really encouraged me to think about the globalization of Britain, about the mass migration of British people to places other than the United States, to these other Anglo-Wests, as he calls them, that were carved out in the settler colonies in the far Pacific. And that's something I hadn't really thought about a whole lot until maybe 15 years ago. And so I've been immensely influenced by his thinking. And he got me to think about, in the age that I'm writing about here, it's still predominantly the US that's drawing most white migrants from the British Isles, but that begins to pivot by the late decades of the century, and of course into the 20th century. It's Australia, New Zealand, South Africa to a degree, that come to rival the U.S. as destinations for white British immigrants. And he got me thinking about that very fruitfully. He got me thinking about the gold rushes in New South Wales and Victoria as a magnet to draw people to Australia and to radically change the nature of its political economy almost overnight. And you see this immense influx of free white migrants who are paying their own way. And that's something that's completely new. And he helped me to think about the growing problem of gender disparity in Australia. And that's a big subtext of the book that I haven't really discussed yet in my answers to your questions, but something that's constantly troubling authorities in all of these different places is that it's the migration is drawing mostly men, or overwhelmingly men. And what that means for the whitening of Australia, if you can't reproduce the white population, what it means for the British Caribbean when the authorities all agreed that it's not appropriate for white workers to work the sugar plantations of British Guyana, even though that would theoretically have been a way to address the issue of famine in Ireland, because people were fleeing for their lives from Ireland at the very moment when the need for plantation labor was greatest in places like British Guyana and Trinidad. But that was out of the question for tropico-racial reasons, right? I think Jim's book really helped me to think about that. So I'm afraid I'm not really taking your bait, Stuart, because I'm having a hard time finding anything to criticize about those books. I feel like I'm standing on the shoulders of many giants, and I couldn't have taken a global turn in my own work without reading those two in particular, really.
Well, if I could just give you some help in the case of Belech, or prompt you, because reading your book, I couldn't, I was really struck how two books could tackle the same subject but be so completely different in the way in which they present, in terms of their methodology, in terms of their sources and so forth. And I guess, one thing that Belech doesn't perhaps have the same sense, or doesn't convey to the same extent, is this sense of everyone being on the move. This is a world on the move, that he's so focused on the Anglo world that he perhaps doesn't quite take in that perspective, and perhaps doesn't quite capture that sense of the bifurcation mid-century of migratory worlds, racially bifurcated worlds, as you do, perhaps.
No, thank you for that, Stuart. And that reminds me that was something I really wanted to sort of stress, is that the movement of 50 million Europeans, over 20% of whom were from the British Isles, disproportionately represented in that mass migration between roughly 1850 and 1920, is rivaled by the migration of maybe 50 million Asian people from mainland, from sort of Central Asia to Southeast Asia at exactly the same time. Another massive Asian migration, largely to places like Siberia, and from point south to point north. So the entire world is on the move at this point, and these different migrations do intersect in interesting ways at this particular kind of beginning point in the 1840s and 50s, where you do have, Stuart, as you know well, plenty of Chinese succeeding to make it into Australia, who are ultimately barred from entry. And so we see the choking off of Asian migration to Australia, to New Zealand, to the Cape, to the U.S. In the later decades of the 19th century. There are experiments with other kinds of labor pools being recruited for work as sugar workers in the Caribbean at this time that are then closed off in the 1850s and 60s for similar reasons. So this one mass migration is only one of three that are going on simultaneously. And I haven't seen much work that tries to address all three through the same lens. And while mine is really focusing on that European migration almost exclusively, there are ways in which the other migrations intersect with that European migration that I think it's fruitful for us to think about and continue to talk about. So thank you for that. Seth, I saw your hand a couple of minutes ago.
Hi, thank you, Phil. What an exciting introduction you're giving us, and thank you for the questions, Jill. My question is this. Manning Clark opens up the volume on the 1820s, 30s, and 40s in Australia with this amazing line where he says that he is attempting to tell the story of how we began to acquire an identity and a conscience. And I'm wondering to what extent Kleck and your account of managing mobility in which your remarks so far have included stuff around capital, white settlers, moves between urban and pastoral economies. So big global capital kinds of questions. To what extent do you think that these actors are also intent to produce a particular kind of moral subject in the face of convictism? And to what extent does CLEC care about, and the other actors you're analyzing, the kind of moral, religious, and ideological conditions of these free laborers vis-a-vis the bushrangers, the convicts, the emancipists, who in some ways they are meant to both supplement and surpass?
Thank you for the question, Seth, because I think the moral issue looms even larger than the economic one. I think this notion of making white Australia an exemplary colony rather than a penal colony is something that appeals to the colonial office from a very early day. You see plenty of traces of it in their correspondence. You certainly see it a great deal in the correspondence around the kinds of migrants that the Australian authorities, colonial authorities, want to see, and the kind of immigrants that the British government is trying to recruit, not always successfully, and the ones that they, to put it crudely, have to settle for. And there are people who get caught up in that moral project and are tarred with the brush of immorality, I think in many cases really quite unfairly. And this is where I think they're pretty well known now by at least people who study migration in mid-century, because it's such an interesting case study. But the migration, the sponsored migration of Irish orphan girls, young women who've lost both parents or at least one parent, who are spending time in the Irish, the desperately overcrowded Irish workhouses in the late 1840s. And there actually is a subsidized, like the British government, this is one of the few places where British taxpayers are on the hook to actually move poor people to Ireland, to Australia, was to try to get about 4,000 of these orphan girls to Australia. And nobody really wanted them. The Australian authorities didn't want them. They thought that they hadn't been given any kind of proper training in domestic service, in the Irish workhouses. Why would they, really, given the crisis that was plaguing those workhouses at that time? There was a common assumption that most of them were loose sexually, or that professional prostitutes were overrepresented among these girls, and there's really no evidence to suggest that was the case. Now, once they get to Australia, and they have been written about, and we know more about them than we do about most of these other migrants, because, and we'll talk more about the silences in the historical record, particularly around Black and brown migration in the 1840s and 50s, which is pretty profound. But you can find websites that are dedicated to the genealogies of these Irish orphan girls, and many of them actually did go on to make certainly much better lives for themselves in Ireland or in Australia than they ever could have hoped for had they stayed in Ireland into the 1850s. But they really weren't wanted. But they were sent in any case, and they were grudgingly accepted. And so that moral judgment is something which is very powerful. In a way, you see it even in the Caribbean migration, because the racist assumptions of colonial authorities and metropolitan authorities alike are interestingly hierarchical in terms of their ideas about who the ideal sugar worker really was. And for them, the ideal were the African Caribbean people who no longer wanted to be involved in sugar work post-emancipation. Second to that were West African people. And the British government manages to transplant about 36,000 of them. This to me is amazing. This has to do with the interception of slave vessels on the high seas by the Royal Navy. But 36,000 of these so-called liberated Africans, other people maybe more appropriately refer to them as recaptives, are kind of coaxed, not necessarily entirely of their own volition. That's a debatable question. But they end up working on plantations as indentured sugar workers. But there aren't enough of them to solve the labor shortage problem in places like Trinidad and British Guiana, the very rapidly growing sugar frontiers of the Caribbean. So the next best, as far as the racial assumptions, the moral racial assumptions of the authorities go, would be sugar workers from Madeira and the Azores. And there's a famine among these sort of Portuguese-speaking people at about that time, and tens of thousands of them actually do migrate, mostly to British Guiana. And some of them start out in sugar work, but most of them leave it pretty quickly. So there aren't enough of them. There's a thought that Chinese workers are going to be stronger, sturdier, with a more reliable work ethic than Indian workers on the sugar plantations. So there's a fairly catastrophic experiment to try to transport tens of thousands of Chinese workers to the sugar frontier. That doesn't really take hold very well for reasons that we can talk about or not. And it's really only after all this experimentation that the authorities in the Caribbean and at home realized that the one conduit for migrant labor, which is inexhaustible and potentially indefinite, is the one from South Asia. And so that's when the organized indentured traffic of people, mostly from Calcutta and Madras, really kicks in. And even then, the authorities in the West Indies hate Madrasis, and they would much prefer Indian workers who came in through the Calcutta immigration depot. They're thought to be more reliable. They're less of an urban population. They're more malleable, and at least in the opinions of the West Indian authorities. So there are moral assumptions being applied to these prospective immigrants at every possible juncture, and all of these projects are riddled with certain kinds of moral assumptions in the building of moral hierarchies, some of which are predicated on the notions of how productive a laborer is this kind of person going to be as opposed to that person. So it's hard to separate the globalizing economic thinking about these colonial authorities and metropolitan authorities from their moral thinking, because they're working fist and glove with each other. So thank you for that question.
Thank you so much. Can't wait to read your book. Congratulations.
I think
I saw John Connolly.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much. I love the book. I have it back there, and also interested in many of the questions you just touched on about moral visions and labor, and but for here, I was kind of curious to ask a writing question and a process question, because when you look at the table of contents, I think at first you think case studies, but I was struck in reading by the alternation between Australia and the West Indies, and that seemed to reinforce one of the main arguments about divergence or bifurcation. So I was just curious if you could tell us about some of the writing questions you faced in dealing with material from so many different places at once, and wanting to draw connections while also following some of the detail and not homogenizing those places. How did you think about that? How did you think about those choices and come to the structure of the book?
Thank you for that question, John. And I struggled with this for a long time, and I felt for a long time kind of unworthy of all of these different literatures, because I had to read so broadly, and it meant that I couldn't read in the kind of depth maybe I would have felt more comfortable reading in many cases. And it took time for me to realize that I could kind of tell a global story, and that maybe the best way to do that, at least for me, would be to alternate the narrative structure. And that was a little tricky for me. Part of it was following the flow of people. Irish people obviously loom very large in the Australian story, as well as the famine story. And I wanted to start with the famine because I thought that that was probably the migration that most potential readers of the book probably know the most about. And it's also kind of the atypical story, and it's the one in that it's the one where the spontaneous nature of the migration is again probably best represented. So there was that, and I also just realized that there was enough scholarship. There was so much great scholarship that was coming out in the last decade in all these different areas. I mean, I learned so much from your book. As I was pretty far along with my own work on the British West Indies when your book came out, but I learned so much from it, and I was humbled by it because I knew that I couldn't go as deep as you did because I was trying to cover too much ground. But I felt like there's got to be a way that I can connect these very different stories. And I thought the metropolitan authorities and how they thought about these different stories simultaneously provide me with a way to do that. And so the balance was to be able to generalize across all these different, very discrete and distinctive migrations in a way that enabled me to draw sound generalizations about all of them and to bring them all into the same conceptual frames. And I found that very difficult to do. But I thought the authorities themselves did a good job of pointing me in the direction of how they thought, what they thought was happening. And then I could go back to the ground and to see how it actually played out. And I also thought that trying to trace the stories of these mostly nightmare voyages that went wrong, that became the lead into all of my body chapters, was one way of getting into the particularities of these different migrations and gesturing toward the lived experience of the migrants themselves. And this is something that concerned me greatly as somebody who was really kind of interested in issues of governance. A lot of what I was doing was conceptually going to have to be top down. But there's such a rich literature now in the lived experience of migrants in all these different areas. And I felt that if I drew from that sufficiently, I could gesture at the lived experience of these various different people, and at least try to suggest the kinds of agency that highly disadvantaged people were trying to exercise in the face of powerful forces that were designed to, frankly, keep them poor, only frankly in just in other parts of the world if they survived the ordeal. That was easy for me to do in the Australian example because there's more of an archival record of the early migrants. I know it's something that all of us who work at all in the British Caribbean struggle with, is that you really don't hear the voices of indentured sugar workers in the early decades. You do a little bit later. But I was able to, there's this amazing story of a couple of guys, and I think there wasn't a big migration to Jamaica, indentured migration to Jamaica for reasons we don't have to get into. But a couple of these guys were indentured workers really early on in Jamaica, and they fled. And John, you talk a lot, very eloquently about flight as a form of resistance in the British West Indies among indentured workers. And I was kind of trying to riff on that a little bit. But these guys, they do save enough money from their sugar work to purchase a passage to Liverpool. And then a magistrate in Liverpool decides that, what are we going to do with these guys? And he actually figures out a way to, I'm not sure how he did it, but he figures out a way to subsidize their fares back to Calcutta. And I thought, what a heroic story that these guys managed to do that. I also talk a lot about people who fled and died, because there's a great deal of death in the cane brakes. There's also a great deal of flight from places like Trinidad to Venezuela, because they're about 18 miles away from each other, but it's very dangerous. You have to cross water to get to Venezuela. But if you get there and you're a sugar worker who hates what they're doing, you've left the British Empire. And there's an interesting correspondence between the Venezuelan the British consul in Caracas and the colonial office about a handful of Indian sugar workers who fled. They're now in Venezuela. He knows where they are. He knows what they're doing. One of them is an apprentice tinsmith. There's no way they can bring them back to Trinidad. And so here are some young men who exercised heroic agency in fleeing circumstances that they found intolerable. So I wanted to gesture in the direction of those human stories and try to insert a human dimension into what otherwise would have been a very abstract tale. And it's a delicate balancing act. I'm not sure I was able to bring it off, but it was something I was trying to achieve.
There are other questions. Well, I can certainly jump in. Oh, go for it, Carol.
Sorry, I had to find my unmute button.
I
Phil,
can
it's
relate.
nice to see you again after our early start in the NACBS, and now we've both moved down south. I have taken a lot of notes. This is awesome. I haven't read the book yet, but I'm excited to. Early on, you said something about how building an economic order that benefited Britain created havoc in the rest of the world. And you just talked about how it created havoc with migration, but could you say a little bit about how it created havoc in the places where the British came and stayed, like Australia or places like that? What happened to the indigenous populations?
And that, yeah, I mean, absolutely. And that's not something I get into in detail in the book, but of course the whole fantasy, the utopian dream of a white Australia is predicated first and foremost on encroachment, eradication, genocide, if you want to use the G word. We can debate that. I don't know that you need to have genocidal intentions in carrying out genocide, but none of that would have been possible without the removal of indigenous people and the deliberate killing of indigenous people. And so none of this would have been possible without that as a backdrop. And also the assumption really for the longest time that indigenous people weren't reliable enough workers to be able to do the kinds of work that would, in the minds of the Australian authorities, make a whiter Australia a more profitable one within the global economic order. And that ultimately leads to something that I found really I didn't know about until fairly late in my reading, and that is that in Queensland, by the early 20th century, you have really the only sugar workforce in the world, which is essentially exclusively white. There's an effort to use Pacific Islanders as a source for sugar work in North Queensland. There are some fitful efforts to work with indigenous people in the sugar realm, but ultimately, what Australia becomes so powerful, a way of life really, that becomes unthinkable. And by 1910, all the Pacific Islanders who worked in sugar plantations in Queensland are out, and most of them have gone back to the Pacific Islands, where some of them had actually never even been before. So that's one answer to your question. Another, and this isn't a place where the British settled, but the Opium Wars in mid-century is something that I continued to be interested in because of how opium production and the broadening of the global opium trade is happening in the heyday of laissez-faire and the heyday of British free trade, and how the British think about forcing opium upon a Qing government that's trying not very effectively to keep it out at that time, and the ways. And this book talks a little bit about the ways in which the chaos which is going on in South China at this time, partly as a result of war, mostly as a result of the Taiping Rebellion, the biggest rebellion in human history, that killed maybe 20 million people, which is happening at about the same time, is causing an immense amount of number of people to be dispossessed and to be looking to maybe even leave China in a very chaotic kind of and desperate kind of way. And tens of thousands of these poor people are recruited into boats that are ultimately destined for the Caribbean, more to Cuba and Brazil than to the British West Indies. And a lot of this is in conditions of virtual paraslavery. And the kind of chaos that's going on in the Qing Empire, certainly not completely a result of British intervention, but partly as a result of that, is feeding into this migratory story that I'm telling as well. So there are many ways in which this kind of global violence, which is part and parcel of the mid-19th century experience, is coming back to a Britain which seems to be increasingly at peace with itself, certainly by the 1850s.
Additional questions?
I can't believe we've already killed an hour here. That's amazing to me.
I think we are zeroing in on the hour. And I mean, you've touched on a lot of the questions that I had, certainly surrounding gender with the moral question, and then also agency with the silences in the archives. But I feel as we zero in on the hour, perhaps the last words should go to you, Phil. Is there something you haven't talked about that you would like to talk about with regards to this book?
Boy, I think we were able to cover a lot of ground, so I'm happy with that, and I hope it gave you guys enough of a amuse-bouche to maybe engage with the book, because I'm dying to hear what you think of it. I hope the conversation will continue, and again, I just want to thank the many people, even on this call, who've influenced my thinking over a very lengthy period of time. Because without the work that you put out, without in many cases your own personal encouragement, this volume would never have seen the light of day. So I leave this call the way I entered it, with an immense amount of gratitude for my colleagues who have an interest in British history, British imperial history in the 19th century. The book is really expensive, so if you don't buy it, I can't blame you. But I hope you'll engage with it, and let's continue the conversation, because I'd love to hear what you think about it, and to carry the conversation forward indefinitely. Thanks for the opportunity, you all. I really appreciate it.
Excellent. Thanks. And this was a wonderful conversation. So thanks to you both for doing it. And I hope that everyone here will join me in thanking Jill and Phil for a great event.
Thanks, everybody. Be well. Happy semester to you. And I hope our paths cross sooner rather than later. And thanks, Amanda, for hosting this. This is fantastic. And NACBS is in great hands these days. And thanks very much for all of the hard work that goes into these efforts to broaden the reach of our work. Greatly appreciate it.
Happy to do it. It's one of the very interesting parts of the job. So, all right. Thanks, everyone, for joining.
Bye, guys. Be well. Ciao.